Good morning, geographers and honorary geographers. My name is Elizabeth Chacko, and I'm a professor at the George Washington University. As you know, there's been a rise in global human mobility. International migration as a phenomenon has been growing in complexity and scope. And even as it grows, there are efforts, policies, indeed even physical barriers that prevent the movement of people freely within a country and between countries. To look into this issue, we have a panel of wonderful people here who come from different walks of life and different organizations. To my extreme right, we have Dr. Phillip Connor, who is the senior researcher at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. Next to him is Ms. Kelly Razzouk, who's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the International Rescue Committee. And finally, Dr. Patricia Ehrkamp, who is Professor and Chair of Geography at the University of Kentucky. So what we will be doing is that each of them will come up and speak, or sit there and speak, and then I will pose some questions to them. And after that, you have the opportunity to ask them questions. So with that, let's start with Phillip.
Good morning, and thank you for this invitation to be here. As we consider the number of people around the world that live outside of a country in which they were born in, which is estimated to be a little bit more than 250 million people as of a year or two ago, we can think of the variety of drivers and reasons of why people move from one country to the other, namely economic reasons, perhaps joining family, conflict, climate, a variety of reasons that people might lead people to go to a new place. However, as they may move to a new place, borders, as we've been discussing here, and policies, may not always fit with actually the movement that they are going. And so you end up with a population that can be unauthorized within a certain geographic space. And if we look more specifically to two very important destinations for migrants, of which nearly 100 million of the world's migrants live in, US and Europe, we can look a little more specifically on this unauthorized immigrant population that lives there. And if I narrow in even just a little bit further, if I may, if we look specifically at, in the United States, those that are non-US citizens, or more specifically in Europe, those that are non-EU or European Free Trade Association country citizens, this provides even a more tight comparison between the two groups of about 25 million people each that live in those geographic spaces. So today I do want to do a comparison real briefly on some recent research that we released on the unauthorized immigrant population within Europe, pairing that with that in the United States that we have been doing for a number of years. And one thing I want us to keep in mind as we look at these populations and compare them, demographically speaking, that they are relatively a small share of the population overall in these two places. So in Europe, it amounts to less than 1% of the total population living in Europe, a little more than 3% in the United States. But their numbers are not necessarily that small, which we'll get to in just a moment. First, though, it is always important to define the population that we're actually speaking of here. In a very simple sense, unauthorized immigrants, as we have defined them, are non-citizens living in their country of residence without a residency permit. And I do want you to keep in mind that these estimates are for stocks of population, not flows in any given year. Now, there's no universal definition of what is an unauthorized immigrant. And you may have heard of other terms that use the terms irregular, undocumented, but these are the groups that we include in our definition for unauthorized immigrants. It includes those that entered without permission, visa overstayers, those that are, could be deported, but their deportation has been deferred for whatever reasons, asylum seekers waiting for a decision, as well as in Europe, in particular, children born to unauthorized immigrant parents, because there are very few countries that have birthright citizenship. And I know among geographers, I'm a sociologist, so I'll be careful here, but in terms of what we're defining as Europe, we're speaking more specifically here of European Union member countries in 2017, as well as the EFTA countries there. So when we're speaking of non-citizens in Europe, we're not speaking of those that are migrating within these European countries, okay? So let's look at some numbers for comparison between Europe and the United States. First, Europe's unauthorized immigrant population is about half the size of that in the United States. So in 2017, we estimated that there were about 3.9 million to 4.8 million unauthorized immigrants living in Europe, compared with the United States, where it's about 10.3 to 10.7 million. So less than half that live in Europe compared with the United States. But let's look at the trend just for a moment for just these most recent years from 2014 to 2017. In Europe, we can see that it somewhat peaked in 2016 and then has since leveled off. And then in the United States, there's been this kind of downward decline. In fact, that decline's been happening earlier than 2014, basically since the Great Recession. Now, what kind of explains some of this? Well, in Europe, as we well know, the surge of refugee asylum seekers that came in certainly had a way of lifting that total up in 2016. However, if we do not include asylum seekers waiting for their actual case to be heard and decided, we still see a very similar trend, although just all the numbers go down a little lower. In the United States, the downward trend is largely explained by the number of Mexican unauthorized immigrants living in the United States, that there are fewer each year as time goes by. In fact, in 2017, less than half of the unauthorized immigrant population were of Mexican nationality, according to our estimates. So speaking of national origins, how does this play out differently in Europe compared to the United States? Well, the unauthorized immigrant population, in terms of their origins, are far more diverse than those in the US. No more than 30% come from any given region, as we have listed here. And then if we look at the US, 3/4 or more are from the Americas alone, of which nearly half are from just one country, Mexico. But how long also have they lived in each of these places? Well, by our estimates, we were able to find that the population that is in Europe among unauthorized immigrants are more recent. Over half have lived there for less than 5 years, compared to a little less than half for 5 years or longer. Whereas in the United States, over half, indeed 68%, have lived there for 10 years or longer. And this is somewhat explained as some of the flows that I mentioned earlier, with the movement of asylum seekers into Europe in recent years, whereas in the United States, many unauthorized immigrants came prior to the Great Recession, as of 2017 with these numbers. And then a quick demographic look here. In Europe, a greater share are actually less than the age 35, or more than half are less than age 35, whereas in the United States, more than half are 35 years or older. We can concede these differences. And that somewhat is explained by the fact of the movement of when this occurred. In Europe, more recent. In the United States, a while back. Most people move from one country to the other in an earlier age, in their 20s or so forth. And so this has an impact as to what population and how they're aging today in these two spaces. And finally, because I know our time is very short this morning, I wanted to share the sex breakdown. In fact, across Europe and the United States, we see that slight majorities in the US and Europe are male, 54% according to our estimates in both. So I hope this kind of just provides a slice of one aspect of immigration, people moving across borders, that can hopefully enliven our discussion later on, and look forward to your questions at that time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to be speaking on this panel, and thank you to my former colleague at the State Department, Dr. Wesley Reiser, for the invitation. I started out my career about a decade ago, right out of law school at the State Department, working for Dr. Lee Schwartz, as he was my first boss in the Office of the Geographer in Global Issues at the State Department for Global Issues. And I would have never thought at that point that I would be here with you today at this incredible conference and to have the opportunity to speak on such an important issue. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm now having the honor to represent the International Rescue Committee, which is working to reach people on the move. Many of those people in over 40 countries around the world. We're also the largest US resettlement agency working in US cities. When we look at people on the move, I want to just lay out the landscape for you a bit. We saw the images of those refugees, of those people on the move earlier, but we are facing an unprecedented refugee and displacement crisis around the world. 70 million people are displaced by conflict, by persecution, or disaster. This is more than at any point since World War II. We have almost 30 million refugees around the world, and about 90% of those refugees are now in poor or lower middle income countries. So they are in Bangladesh, in Jordan, in Kenya, and Pakistan. 1 in every 110 people in the planet is a refugee or a displaced person. And a critical fact to understand when we look at these numbers is that around 2 to 3%, only 2 to 3% of those people actually went home last year. So we're looking at people moving out of their countries of origin and not returning, which is a critical aspect when we look at these numbers and look at this issue. Refugees are now being displaced for an average of 10 years, and most of the conflicts around the world are lasting for an average of 20 years. There are also several trends when we think of these refugee populations. About half of the refugees are children. So this means that we have entire generations of children who have never known a life outside of a refugee camp. Or if they are in cities, they've never known their country of origin and have very little connection to their countries of origin. Refugee children are 5 times more likely to be out of school than their non-refugee peers. School-aged children here in New York get an average of about 180 to 190 days of school every year. And each year, 3.5 million children around the world get 0 days of school. Child marriage tends to rise in refugee contexts. 1 in 5 women who are refugees or displaced by an emergency experience sexual violence. And in Syria, we've seen families displaced 5 to 10 times since the escalation of the conflict. So to summarize that, what we're seeing is that people on the move have critical needs. These are often very vulnerable populations, and often we're not seeing the corresponding efforts from governments to meet those needs. One of those huge gap areas that I wanted to talk briefly about this morning is in the race by governments to achieve what's called the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are the targets and goals that governments agreed to, and they agreed to reach these targets by 2030 in areas like health, education, well-being. And one of the critical facts is that people on the move are basically invisible in SDG implementation. And what I mean by that is that when countries are developing their national action plans for achieving these global goals, they're leaving out refugees. When they do household surveys, refugees are not counted. When they self-report to the United Nations on the progress made to achieve these SDGs, refugees are rarely included in these reports. Countries are often looking very narrowly at their citizens or people with a specific legal status when they're crafting their targets on education or health. And so this entire group of people is falling through the cracks and entirely missing from this action plan. We will not meet the SDGs and we won't achieve these targets unless we start counting these people on the move and these people who have moved already. The positive news, though, is that there's an opportunity for correcting course. And we're sitting here in New York, so to use a New York illustration, when that ball drops in Times Square this year at midnight, the clock starts ticking on the next decade we have left to achieve these SDGs, these global goals. And governments can take action to achieve real results in the next decade. One of those moments for action will be the Global Refugee Forum that's coming up in Geneva on December 17 and 18. It's the first ever forum of its kind that grew out of the Global Compact for Refugees that was adopted by the United Nations last year. This will be an opportunity for governments to come to make pledges to include refugees in their planning to reach the global goals. in their national action plans, in their national reviews, and this would be a significant step to help accelerating SDG progress. We're still a long way off from making these global goals a reality and ensuring that when it comes to things like education, all girls have the same opportunities no matter where you are on the map, from Manhattan to Mosul. People on the move have the same basic desires for their children that all of us do. Refugee mothers have the same concerns for their children that I have for my 3 daughters. And we need to ensure that this next decade is one of action to deliver concrete results for the people who need it the most, including these people on the move. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. And thanks also for the invitation to speak. Thanks to Elizabeth for getting us organized. So what I want to do today is make a few points with regard to people being on the move, and I focus here on refugees from the Middle East that are hoping to enter the United States through the UN-based resettlement process or have already arrived here. That option in and of itself is only available to less than 1% of everybody. So the first point is there is no simple or neat division between spaces of war and spaces of peace. Second point is people on the move are actually often not moving, as we've heard. And third, resettlement itself is an unsettling experience. I base these comments on research I've been conducting with my colleagues Jenna Lloyd and Anna Secor, and our research has been funded by the National Science Foundation. But here comes the disclaimer: any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed here are ours and do not necessarily reflect the views of the NSF. So we began working in 2015, and we started with the realization that refugees are often defined and cared for through a medical diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, both in the US and internationally. So we use the lens of mental health, trauma, and PTSD to examine the admissions and resettlement process across the globe. The full scope of our project involves interviews with UNHCR and IOM staff in Turkey and in Jordan, as well as interviews with mental health professionals and service providers in both countries and panel physicians. Then we interviewed local resettlement agencies and mental health service providers in 4 US cities. 2 of them are newer immigrant destinations and 2 of them are traditional gateways. And finally, we talked to Iraqi refugees themselves who have been resettled in the US. So let me elaborate on these points. There's no simple or neat division between spaces of war and spaces of peace, as we so often imagine. Our interviews with those involved in the resettlement process or experiencing resettlement shows that a geopolitics of trauma, which is what we call this, collapses the spatial and temporal distance between sites of war and of peace. For example, those hoping to be resettled by the United Nations resettlement protocols have to recount their stories multiple times in interviews and in security screenings, which, in the words of a mental health provider in Istanbul, is horrible for people who have survived torture. She said, quote, "Because they have to tell their story to someone who investigates them, it's like the police have arrived again. It's like it could easily turn into a reiteration of the trauma because of the setting and because it doesn't really work well, because the UN is very busy and because there are many refugees. There's a huge waiting process and it turns into violence for them because they've been waiting. They don't know when the waiting will finish. They don't know. They don't have any bit of control during the process. And somebody who's been traumatized, they're really anxious and they really want to have control," end quote. So not only are these interviews along the way a proving ground for refugees that have to actually explain that they are eligible and legitimate refugees, but it also turns into a moment where some refugees may be re-traumatized. And it's this setting of repeated interviews where we can start thinking about the trauma of displacement as an ongoing process through all of these various interviews rather than a result of a discrete event that took place somewhere else. Second, and this has been mentioned before, people on the move are actually not moving. To echo some of what Alison Mounds suggested yesterday, the process of refugee resettlement is one in which immobility and protracted uncertainty and waiting very often dominate refugees' experiences. Resettlement is based on international law, so refugees must go through a registration, a refugee status determination interview, and then through recurrent national security and Department of Homeland Security procedures before they're being accepted for resettlement in the US. These procedures are, of course, in place, to quote the Department of Homeland Security, quote, to ensure that those being admitted through the refugee program are not seeking to harm the United States, end quote. So during our research in Istanbul and Ankara in the summer of 2015, refugees arriving in Turkey and just registering with the local implementing partner of the UNHCR were issued refugee status determination interviews as far out as 2023. That's 8 years from their arrival in Ankara. And that's just the first step towards entering the resettlement process. Our informants at this implementing partner of the UNHCR emphasized that these protracting waiting periods had consequences for the mental health of their clients. They pointed to frustrations with waiting, and they also suggested that refugees were seeking other solutions. One official said, quote, "But when they face the waiting period, the mental health problems are starting." It's a much longer quote. And then he continued, "Because they learned that UNHCR will meet them in 2023, they tried to use their chance to go to European countries, and now they are using Serbia, Greece, Macedonia, and Germany," end quote. So refugees confronted with the waiting reality develop anxieties and so forth, and then they try to cope with that anxiety by moving, which may turn some of them into the unauthorized migrants that Phillip was talking about. My third point, resettlement is an unsettling experience. Well, we have to be careful, and very much careful, so not to reduce refugees to experiences of the trauma that turned them into refugees in the first place. We also need to understand that the resettlement process is deeply imbued with traumatizing experiences. In fact, much of the current mental health protocols in place for resettlement are insufficient, and better practices are needed. Our research shows that the changing legal and political situation in the US is an important settlement stressor that causes significant anxiety. For example, our interviewee from a nonprofit that treats victims of torture noted in 2017, she said, "We've had a lot of returning clients recently because of the political climate. They've been calling and saying, 'I think I need to see a counselor again.' And some of them are people who have been doing well for 2 to 3 years without support," end quote. Finally, in a focus group we conducted last year with a group of Iraqi men and women who'd been resettled decades ago, an Iraqi woman in her early 60s talked about the health impact of changing family unification laws. She said, quote, "One more thing for us, the laws that are going to change are really scaring us. I mean, we're really going to have psychiatric issues. For me, honestly, I'll have a psychiatric issue and maybe I'll go and see Dr. O. If my children don't come to where I am, I still will not be comfortable, even though this is the country of dreams. The laws should be easier on refugees, not so hard. The situation is going to get worse," end quote. So these are just some of the examples that show that we need to understand the geopolitics of trauma and refugee resettlement as an embodied experience that remaps relationships between foreign and domestic places. And what I want to end on is really the idea that spaces of security and care, of peace and war, are interwoven, and there are new connectivities that emerge when we talk to refugees about their experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Phillip, Kelly, and Patricia for that insight into refugees and migration, mobility and immobility, which a lot of us don't think about, the immobile part of it. So I'm going to ask you a long question. In recent years, many national or country borders have hardened and become militarized, and native-born populations have become increasingly nationalistic. In such countries, anti-immigrant and anti-refugee rhetoric often depicts migrants and refugees in negative terms, as a drain on the economy or a threat to national security, and other things. What counter-arguments and concrete examples could you offer to refute such claims?
Would you like me to go? Okay, great. Well, one thing that you should know about the Pew Research Center is that we are non-advocacy, and we don't speculate in terms of policies. So we provide numbers, and so that's what I'm going to do to answer this particular question. We didn't do a trend analysis on this question because we've only asked in our battery of countries that we actually look at, battery of questions in countries. But we did ask people in 27 countries, representing about more than half of the world's population of immigrants, if they would like to have more immigrants, fewer immigrants, or have about the same number that they do now. And majorities, sorry, I should just back up, about median said that about 45% median across those countries said they wanted to have fewer. Whereas 36% say they want to have about the same, and only 14% said they'd like to have more. So it does provide a bit of a picture as to might lean more on the fewer side, but there's also a large share that say they would like to have about the same number of immigrants as they do already. One other kind of perplexing issues, though, in the same poll that we asked is we asked, do you support the immigration of highly skilled people? And majorities in most countries said yes. Do you support refugees to come in there fleeing disaster, conflict, and violence? And the majorities of people in most countries say yes. So there is this kind of tension between, at least from these data, that there's a tension on immigration more broadly, but also at the same time for certain groups may not always be perceived in the same way.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, the International Rescue Committee has done some work on this, looking at specifically the economic impacts. And we've found that refugees are incredibly hardworking. They come to a country, and because they face so many challenges, they really are driven to want to invest in that country. And we found that there is lower employee turnover in terms of employment, and there's higher retention rates for refugees who go into those businesses. And they also bring diversity to the workforce. They bring a lot of new ideas with them. One of the other things is there was a 2017 Department of Health and Human Services report that the New York Times published that looked at a 10-year period, and they found that the net fiscal impact of refugees was positive over that 10-year period at about $63 billion. So while there are some initial upfront costs to bringing in refugees to a country, the revenue from taxes, from business permits, from other types of fees and investments actually ends up being a huge public benefit. And we've seen that in a number of cities across the US where refugees have really contributed to the growth of some of these cities and have been, have made incredible contributions, particularly refugees who are in that window of 18 to 45, the ages of 18 to 45 have made some significant contributions. And just one more point about refugees around the world. The International Rescue Committee did a report over the summer with Georgetown University, the Women's Policy Institute there, looking at refugee women around the world, and if some of the gaps were closed to allow women to work in some of these countries, we found that that could generate up to $1.4 trillion to annual global GDP if some of these employment and wage gaps were closed. So I think significant benefits. So not only just the moral justification, but as you're saying, also a huge economic benefit to countries.
Just one quick example from Germany, where Angela Merkel, the chancellor, in 2015 made the argument that because Germany is aging rapidly, refugees were needed in order to replace the shrinking labor force. So there's one way of thinking about refugees making a contribution, or asylum seekers making a contribution that the domestic population cannot be making. I also want to mention, though, that yes, we have these wonderful stories of people contributing, but I do want to caution against talking about the good versus the bad immigrants, and I want to think about all people having the ability to make contributions to a society, whether they're highly skilled or not college educated, because they are here for a reason, especially in the United States, and so I don't want to forget that.
Thank you. What are the implications of recent changes in US refugee policy for refugees and for agencies, and for the international humanitarian system? And Phillip, you may or may not want to answer this.
Well, I can give you some numbers.
Okay.
I love giving numbers.
We love data.
Yeah, so just one thing to keep in mind in the US system as a whole, of just some of the trends, and I'm sure that Kelly can point to this as well, that we have seen a decrease in the number of refugees that resettle in the United States. I think that is well known. But just in comparison to what's happening around the globe, there's been some key moments in this. In 2017, for example, was the first year in which the US did not resettle more refugees than all other countries in the world combined. And then in 2018, the US fell as being the top recipient of refugees to resettling. That was now replaced by Canada, 28,000 to Canada, 23,000 in 2018, calendar year 2018 in the United States. So maybe that gives us a little bit of a global perspective of how the movement of refugees are happening at the resettlement side. This is not, of course, asylum seekers that are appearing at a border or after they've come into a border, but at least on the refugee resettlement side.
Thank you so much. So I think it's a really important question, and especially this month, when we just got the numbers from last month, where the U.S. resettled 0 refugees. For the first time since the U.S. has started counting and tracking refugees, we have resettled 0 refugees at a time when the refugee crisis, as I mentioned, is of such a global scale. So I think that's just a staggering reality. And the resettlement of refugees in the United States has always been a bipartisan issue. It has never been a politicized, or it has rarely been a politicized issue. It has had support. The refugee program has had support, bipartisan support. And the numbers of the average has been about 95,000 per year. And so we just saw the executive order come out last month saying that the ceiling for refugee resettlement this year would be 18,000, which is a historic low and is yet to be seen if we even get to that number. So I think a lot of us are very concerned about that and about what that means. As was just mentioned, the US has been a global leader in this area. We have strict vetting procedures for refugees. So these are individuals who are really fleeing persecution, who are in the most need of resettling to another country. And so I think there's a lot of concern about what this means with the US stepping back really from supporting refugees. And hopefully other countries, as was mentioned, Canada has taken in a law, Germany, hopefully other countries will continue to do so. But a lot of us are very concerned about what this means for the US, and I think there are some bills and things that are the GRACE Act that's making its way through the Senate, the House and the Senate, and many of us are hopeful that we'll be able to reverse the US intent here, but I think it is a real cause for concern for many of us who work in this space.
I agree, so. But it's also the US is operating in context where we've seen around the world, and again, Alison Mounts talked a little bit about that, but the idea that we don't even let people come into the country in order to apply for asylum, where states in the global north, so-called global north, have put into place procedures of keeping people out. The United States has just done that with the southern border of the US. So there is growing reason for concern, and I am from Germany, so I like to remind people of the commitments that were made with the Geneva Convention on Refugees, and the idea that displacement is something that concerns all of us, and that's a responsibility of all countries to actually deal with.
Thank you. I know that I have lots of questions, but I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. Anybody?
Hello, my name is David Palmer, and I'm an AP Human Geography teacher from Colorado. And I want to be rest assured the wall between Colorado and Mexico is almost finished. Sorry. My question relates to, and I appreciate your discussion on the resettlement. It's a good insight for me to hear as a teacher. My question is focused on what concrete actions have you found or seen that are most effective in mitigating the negative impacts of being a refugee in the process. And I'm particularly interested in the human development of people and education and maintaining that while they're waiting, because you've discussed that there's a hurry up and wait aspect to being a refugee. And there's the political side of resettlement, but we also know that that's a small percentage of people that actually get resettled. So what have you witnessed or read about that indicates the strongest, most effective ways to at least mitigate these negative impacts and promoting people's human development overall?
Kelly, would you like to? Do you want to?
Sure. No, thank you so much for the question. I think it's a real challenge when you look at some of these countries and refugees around the world, refugee children in particular. Some countries have, strict laws about education, for example, for refugee children, what can be done in those situations, so to ensure that while these children are waiting, they are getting educated, and they're not just sitting there waiting for something to be done. And so one example is a partnership that my organization, the International Rescue Committee, has partnered with Sesame Street to bring refugee children in refugee camps in Jordan and in Lebanon, educational development through what Sesame Street has to offer. So they created in Arabic a new Sesame Street program that was actually featured on 60 Minutes last week, that's really trying to tackle some of the tough issues about what it's like to be a refugee, and to help these children deal with the emotional trauma of being a refugee, while also trying to teach them the ABCs and 1, 2, 3 and all of those things. So innovative solutions like that, where we're seeing non-governmental organizations partnering with some incredible businesses or incredible organizations like Sesame Street that are really trying to tackle that issue in a real concrete way. And so I think some of those solutions are, we've seen really having a great impact in making a difference in children's lives.
Thank you.
There's also, when we were in Turkey in August 2015, it's almost overwhelming to deal with the numbers of people that were arriving. There were 1,500 Syrians arriving every day at the registration site just to register that they were in Turkey. What was one of the biggest problems, so everybody was aware that mental health is an issue, and because a lot of people migrating were also survivors of torture. And what they were doing is really try group therapy or just group conversations for women, for children. One of the biggest issues, though, is that even though you do have counselors and psychologists and psychiatrists in Turkey, and in the big cities especially, there's a massive language barrier between, Arabic speakers and Turkish speakers. And so all of these solutions are important. They also all need funding. And then we do deal with just volume as well.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Jack Eichenbaum still, and my PhD research focused on refugees in various circumstances. And my question is directed to Dr. Connor, please. And it's about how you collected the data on unauthorized refugees. I mean, there were millions of them. So how did you identify them in the field, and then how did you do sampling?
Yeah. So our estimates for unauthorized immigrants living in the United States and Europe are based on a methodology that's been going back for about 15 to 20 years. So essentially, on the US side of things, we take, in very, very simple terms, it's far more complicated than I'm about to describe, but in simple terms, we have, from the American Community Survey, the Census Bureau survey, we're able to determine the number of immigrants that are in the United States as a whole. We also know how many of them are citizens or not, so we subtract those out. And then we also, through some demographic techniques of the flows that have come in lawfully over many years, since basically the last regularization in the 1980s, and doing some demographic updates, have an estimate of the actual number of people who are living in the United States legally. And so when you subtract those two, you have the difference, and it's called a residual method to be able to actually get the difference between those two groups. We apply that same methodology as well in Europe to several countries. Now, the data are not the same kind of type in each country, so we had to make some different adjustments. But that's the basic sense of how we do it. It is not based on an actual survey of immigrants. People may not always be forthcoming about their status on a survey of immigrants. And secondly, being able to have coverage of such a survey is very challenging. But those two issues don't really allow for such a piece like that. But this has been a long-established methodology that's been used not just only in our organization, but also at the Migration Policy Institute, as well as in the Department of Homeland Security. Thank you. And yours.
And I think this will be the final question.
Thank you. Thanks for the panel. It was great. I'm Alison Mounts. I'm a geography professor from Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. And I have two quick questions. One is for Phillip again about the research. And I was curious why you included asylum seekers as unauthorized migrants, because of course, to claim asylum, you have to present yourself to a government and get granted, usually, particularly in the US, temporary status while you await the adjudication of your claim based on the definition of the convention relating to the status of refugees. So I just wanted to know how you decided that. And then my second question is for Kelly and Patricia. And it's about trauma and its representation in our work. I just finished a film called Safe Haven with US war resistors who came to Canada during Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. And a lot of them suffer from PTSD, but don't necessarily talk about it. Like, trauma often goes unspoken, it's silent or unseen. And so we really grappled in the film with how to represent the unspoken effects of trauma. And I think you started to represent it today in your work with the talking to counselors, talking to resettlement officers, and I just wonder how you grapple with that more broadly in your work. Thanks.
Thank you for that question, and it's a great one. So definitions, as I mentioned earlier, are not universal on this particular population group. We did find, as if we include asylum seekers, particularly in the European case, that they amount, asylum seekers waiting for a decision, amount to 20 to 24% of the actual unauthorized immigrant population. And actually in our report, we break those apart. I didn't have a chance in the few moments I had here to show that slide, but even for each country, we show what that population, unauthorized immigrant population, would be without that group. And that's important because, as you have mentioned, they have a legal standing until their case is adjudicated and heard. And conceptually, we know that they entered without permission, and also that rejection rates are high in European as well as the US context. And in the US numbers, going back, we have typically put this group in, as we do include also those with DACA into that group. But we each time also note what group this is as a size. So certainly definitions are very important, and we want to be able to be as transparent as possible of what we're including and what we're not including, but then offering a separate set of numbers depending on which groups are included or not.
Well, thank you for the question about trauma. And so I'll just speak specifically to women who have faced trauma and have come from very traumatic situations, who have fled countries, and come in sometimes to refugee camps or to other areas where we, as the International Rescue Committee, try to create safe spaces for them to have discussions about this and bring in the resources for them to do so. But also something that was touched on that I think was really important is this funding issue, because 0.12% of all humanitarian funding goes to funding of gender-based violence programs. And so I think that is a real concern and something that we really need to bridge in terms of being able to fund these efforts. And we still face a real need when it comes to providing lights in refugee camps so women feel safe at night, and to, providing locks on facilities so that they feel safe. And so I think that really is a gap area and where we need to be doing more. And we have the big Beijing Plus 25 conference coming up at the UN this September, celebrating achievement on women's issues, and we really do need to be doing better when it comes to getting women the services and the funding that we need to fund grassroots women's organizations.
Thanks, I agree. There's more funding needed also, of course, domestically in the US. Two quick examples. One, we did an interview with a young Iraqi man in one of our research sites, and we had arranged the interview to be at a public library, my colleague and I, and so we found a table and we sat at the table. My colleague and I sat next to one another, and the young man sat across the table until he said, "Oh, this is just like another interrogation." So we're very careful to not ask people about their trauma or their experiences, what brought them into the resettlement process. But these very small oversights of how we even spatially arrange an interview are really important. So we learned a lot, and we rearranged our seating, of course, and had a really interesting conversation with this person. The other example is a Iraqi woman who is now also a mental health care provider. And she said, "We have the trauma. It is in this box right here. You don't want to know about it. You can't handle it." So you can't handle it, and it's also the idea that they don't want it to be defined by that trauma, right? So there is trauma there, it's part of their life, but we've moved on also, and there's tremendous resiliency. So, and that's sort of the fine line to walk, where we have either, so we want to understand and we want to acknowledge that people have been through terrible experiences, but that they're also very whole people that have other experiences and other ideas and also a life ahead of them.
So I think we have run out of time. We have lots of questions. I have lots of questions, and feel free to talk to any of them during the lunch break. But would you join me in thanking all the panelists?